Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Well, this should be quite an interesting update because something happened over the last week that hasn't happened in quite a long period of time, and that is that Bitcoin went to its bull market support band. Now, if you're not familiar with that, it's essentially the 20-week SMA and or 21-week EMA. And you can see while it did not actually go to the 20-week SMA, we did, roughly visit that 21-week EMA. I think maybe some exchanges it hit, some that it didn't. But overall, we tested that 21-week EMA. And what we said, and I think we covered this in a video a couple of days ago, was that this is what often happens on an approach to the 20-week SMA after it hasn't been visited in a long time, is you get a reaction off of it, right? Now, this is not the same type of test like you had back over here in the summer of 2023, right? It doesn't mean it can't turn into that, but this is not the same type of test. It's just a wick, right? Now, sometimes that's all you get. Right? There are examples where you just sort of wick down to it. And I mean, we got pretty close here, but still we didn't actually get there. If you go back to 2021, right, you can see we got pretty close there. We got another bounce back up. In 2019, we got pretty close back here. We got another bounce back up. And in 2017, right, there are examples where you just go down and you get nothing more than a wick, down to the bull market support band. So that is something that we've seen before. We know it can happen. And these sorts of bounces are actually quite frequent. And we did a whole video on this a few days ago about, at the very least, right, whether it turns into a correction or whether it turns into another run to the highs. At the very least, you will likely see it at least reverse course in the short term. And one of the reasons for that, if you look at the daily time frame, it's basically the same pattern. There are some slight differences, but it's essentially the same pattern that we saw way back over here. And we actually drew this pattern out on YouTube a few weeks ago. And it's basically like, you had the spot ETF here, and you had the halving here. And then 1 week before the spot ETF, you ran the prior high. 1 week prior to the halving, we did not run the prior high. We got close, right? We got relatively close. We didn't actually take it out. And then the halving ended up being a lower high compared to the spot ETF launch, which was a higher high at the time. But in both cases, we still had a correction in late April to early May down to take out this initial low, right? You see that low there? We took it out at the end of January. And then this low here, we took it out at the end of April and early May. So we sort of drew this outline of, we don't know if we're actually going to run the highs going into the halving or not. I said that my guess was that we would not do it. But that I certainly could empathize with that idea, especially since we did it going into the spot ETF. Again, there does exist a parallel universe, I'm sure, where Bitcoin ran the highs going into the halving. But we got close, didn't quite make it. This, though, still happened, right? This correction to take out the prior low. That still happened, just like it happened back over here after the spot ETF, right? So far, that everything's the same with the exception of the extent of the run into the halving wasn't as impressive as going into the spot ETF, all right? So then where do we go from here? Because, one of the things I drew out a while back was essentially something that looked like this. I don't remember exactly, but it was basically run back to the highs. Eventually, you're going to come back down and you're going to sweep this low, and then you get a move up, and then you consolidate for a bit. That was sort of what I drew out. And I had a lot of people say, like, well, what happens after that? And, I didn't really want to get too far ahead of myself because markets are really difficult to predict. And honestly, I get them wrong all the time. So I don't know why you're asking me anyways. But that was sort of what I drew out, was you run the lows that we took out back in March, or that we put in back in March, and then you come back up into sort of that mid 60 range. Okay? And that was sort of an outline regardless of what comes next. And then now we have to figure out, well, what comes next. But that was sort of the outline regardless. One of the reasons why Bitcoin, I think, just visited its bull market support band is because I think that it is acting as a more volatile version of the stock market. And in the last video we did on the bull market support band, we showed that, well, the S&P has already gone to its bull market support band, right? If we pull an arrow up, right? I can never find it, but I guess it's somewhere in here, right here. So S&P, right? We said, look, guys, it tagged the 20-week SMA. The NASDAQ went below the 20-week SMA. And when we did this video a week ago, we were looking at this and we're like, well, the S&P went to the 20-week SMA. The NASDAQ went below the 20-week SMA. The Russell went below the 20-week SMA. But yet Bitcoin was still way up here, not at its 20-week SMA. And so the argument that we put forth was that, look, guys, it's probably going to go to its 20-week SMA and sort of take out this prior low from March. Okay, so that was sort of some of the justification for it, right? Now the question is, well, where do we go from here? Because, it's great and all that it all played out more or less, kind of according to that outline. But then the question is, well, now that it has done all that, now that it's taken out that low, now that it's rallied back up to the mid 60s, where do we go from here? One thing that might be useful is to see, well, what did the S&P do after it went to the 20-week SMA? What did the NASDAQ do after it went to the 20-week SMA? And if you go look at the S&P, it actually rallied last week. But if you look at the daily moving average, where did it go so far? Right to its 50-day SMA. Now, we closed the week last week. The S&P closed at 51.27, and the 50-day is at 51.29. If you look at the NASDAQ is at close the day on Friday at 17,927, but the 50-day, it closed at 17,890, and the 50-day is 17,927. So just below that 50-day moving average. And then if you look at the Russell, where did it close? Well, on Friday, right? It's already showing you the candle for Monday here. But if you look at Friday, it closed at 2037, and the 50-day SMA was at 2040. So you have the S&P, the NASDAQ, and the Russell all closing Friday just below their 50-day moving average. And so a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, well, the S&P, the NASDAQ, and the Russell are all at their bull market support band, and for some reason, Bitcoin's not, right? And it hadn't. This was back over here, and we're like, well, if it is just a more volatile version of the stock market, it would stand to reason that if you're going to get a correction by the S&P and the NASDAQ and the Russell to the 20-week SMA, 21-week EMA, you're probably going to see it happen for Bitcoin. And now it has. But then we just showed that the S&P, the Russell, and the NASDAQ just went back up to their 50-day moving average. So then it raises the question, well, where is the 50-day for Bitcoin? And if you go look at that, we're getting close to it, but we're still not quite there. The 50-day SMA is right around $66,000. So it's precisely, if you want to know precisely, $65,977. But again, it's going to change. By the time you see this video, it's going to be depending on what exchange you use. It's going to change, right? So it's roughly $66,000. And you can see, in fact, that Bitcoin made it to the 50-day SMA in April. Right? It hit the 50-day SMA at around 67.4K just a couple of weeks ago. So now the 50-day SMA is around 66K. And so that will be the next level that I think the bulls are going to try to see if they can get Bitcoin to, because that's where the S&P is, that's where the NASDAQ is, that's where the Russell is. Now, if it doesn't get there, that would imply a lot of weakness in the Cryptoverse. If it gets there, then it's just more evidence, once again, that we're just sort of operating as a more volatile version of the stock market, and maybe even a somewhat lagged version of the stock market. So that is the next area to look at. But it still raises the question, what comes next? Because again, what if we go to the 50-day? Then what? All right, now we're at 66K. Now where are we going, right? So one thing that I've said before is that in order to get a gauge on this, look at the 8-week moving average with the bull market support band. That, I think, is where sort of the secret lies. Because really, in conjunction with, I know it's a meme, but in conjunction with, Bitcoin dominance and alt Bitcoin pairs and all that stuff. So, as an investor, and I've been saying this for 2.5 years, how do you navigate such times of uncertainty? If you want exposure to the Cryptoverse, if you're in a cycle or in a phase of the cycle where the dominance of Bitcoin's going higher, then you're probably better off with Bitcoin than you are altcoins collectively. But again, as always, some altcoins outperform Bitcoin. But if you sort of buy into the dominance view, then you're better off with Bitcoin than the altcoin market, at least until looser monetary policy arrives, which is still not going to happen this month. There will start to be a shift next month, but it's still not it's slightly looser in terms of QT, but still not into QE territory. And so sort of the question is, well, do you go put in new highs, or do you just kind of put in lower highs? And so what I would say to look for is if Bitcoin bounces around, and we talked about this several months ago, that we would likely get into a phase at some point where we get kind of below that 8-week moving average, but above the bull market support band. And you could even go back above the 8-week SMA in 2019, like we went back above that 8-week moving average, right? A couple of times, several times, in fact, right? But they still were only short-lived, and then we ultimately resolved back below it. So what you would look for, right, is you would look to see what happens to alt Bitcoin pairs in this range. In 2019, when we were ranging like this, right, when we were ranging like this, kind of right here, you saw Bitcoin dominance explode to the upside, and you saw altcoins bleed against Bitcoin, right? So you saw those two things. They're basically the same thing. But again, you could theoretically have a scenario where Bitcoin dominance is going up, and it's just because sort of the larger market cap alts are bleeding to it and not all of them. But that's essentially what happened, is that you saw Bitcoin kind of chop around. It came down, it put in a low, and then put in a slightly lower low. It rallied back above the 8-week SMA, ended up being a lower high, and we came back below it, and then ultimately we went below the bull market support band. But that process took months, right? It took months. And the reason why Bitcoin held on longer than the altcoin market during that time was because people were generally converting their altcoins to Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin had more liquidity that it could use to sort of help prop itself up. For instance, if you were to overlay total 3, right? If you overlay total 3 onto this chart, what you'll notice pretty clearly, in fact, let me switch this to a new scale here. What you'll notice is that while Bitcoin was going sideways, right? You see this, look closely. While Bitcoin was going sideways, alts were going down. And so that was sort of that insight that you needed back then to recognize that it was only a matter of time before Bitcoin would follow suit. Because the reason why Bitcoin was holding strong was because people were converting their alts to Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was the only thing, well, not the only thing, there were a few altcoins, but mostly collectively the altcoin market was going down and Bitcoin was going sideways. That's actually a pretty brutal market to be in, to be completely honest, if you're not prepared for it. And so I think that is what you look for. Does the altcoin market pick up with Bitcoin, or does it bleed, right? So if we go to it today, it's kind of too early to say, right, is the truth. I could try to come up with a narrative, right? But over here, when you look at total 3, what it did was it came down, it got a little bit of a rally, it came down, got a little bit of a rally, and it was just a slow process. But on it, this took place over months, right? But in any given week, who knew, right? I mean, it popped up and you could have said, all right, well, now it's going to pick up the pace. And so when you look at it today, you can see it's gone down quite a bit, in fact, even though, guess what? Bitcoin has gone sideways. It might not feel like Bitcoin has gone sideways, but think about it like this. Bitcoin was at 64K last week. At some point last week, it was at 64K. At some point the week before, it was at 64K. At some point the week before, it was at 64. At some point the week before, it was at 64K. At some point the week before it was at 64. There was this week, 1 week right here where it wasn't at 64. And then the week before that, it moved through that 64K level. And then the week before that, it was at 64K. And the week before that as well. So while there has been a big wick to the downside, and, you know, obviously everyone's now feeling pretty good. They're like, all right, that's a pretty good retest. At the end of the day, it's still sideways so far. Now, that doesn't mean it can't resolve into something else. I mean, you can see what happened over here. After the long wick down, we basically had a week where we consolidated below the 8-week SMA, and then it exploded to the upside. There does exist a scenario where that happens, right? There also exists a scenario where, you know, we just kind of go up a little and then come back down. Kind of like this, right? Kind of like this, where you sort of get to the bull market support band, and then you go back up to the 8-week moving average, but you get rejected by it. So that also is a potential scenario to sort of keep in mind. And I look at this and I just say again, and I think that one thing I've tried to do for the last 2 years, 2.5 years, to say, well, how do you navigate that as an investor? Because obviously, you know, a lot of investors want exposure to crypto, and I've said before, right? I mean, Bitcoin is the better place to be because and this is a big if, right? But if Bitcoin resolves to the upside and puts in new highs, this whole move has taught you that when that happens, Bitcoin dominance goes up and alts bleed against it, right? But if, on the other hand, it just kind of resolves to a lower high and then ends up just going sideways for a couple more months, you still have time, right? You still have time to see that play out and to see that develop and see if those altcoins just keep on bleeding back to Bitcoin while Bitcoin kind of just keeps chopping sideways. Or, on the other hand, do they pick up? Like, you know, do they pick back up and get another leg higher themselves? And so, again, it's impossible to know what the outcome is, but my argument for the last 2.5 years has been it's impossible to predict the price of Bitcoin USD. We can try, we'll fail. But Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside while it also minimizes your downside risk. Okay? So, I mean, listen, if 2 months from now, or let's say a month from now, if a month from now, Bitcoin is still doing this, kind of between 60, 70K, it's still just kind of going sideways. And if alts are dropping during that time, right? I don't know why I got rid of it. We're just going to pull it right back up. But if alts are dropping during a time where Bitcoin is going sideways, then it would be very similar to that sort of that local top from 2019, right? Because the reality is that while Bitcoin is back up to where it's basically been for the last 2 months, you know, I don't know. Can you say the same thing about alts? Maybe some alts. I don't know if you could say it about all alts. If you look at it, you can see that alts haven't really recovered in the same way, right? I mean, again, it's not just my opinion. It's just, look, I mean, you know, Bitcoin is basically back to where it's been for the last several weeks, whereas alts, they've been down here for a while, but they're still nowhere near where they were back up here. You know, I mean, there's several weeks over here, right? 1, 2, 3 weeks where they're at higher levels than they are at right now. Whereas for Bitcoin, there was only 1 week where it basically didn't hit its current level. And so if Bitcoin like chops around, like think about it like this. If Bitcoin were to chop around and then alts go up a little bit, but then Bitcoin gets another drop, you know, off its 8-week SMA, and then alts put in a new low, and then Bitcoin rallies back up. That is kind of what happened in 2019. That's sort of what happened in 2019, where, like, you know, Bitcoin kind of just kept doing pretty well, and then alts just kept going down, and then here is where Bitcoin fell below its bull market support band. And that right after that, then alts rallied for about a month and a half to another lower high. But that, I think, is something to look for. If, on the other hand, Bitcoin goes up and then you have altcoins going up commensurate with it, then that would be different from a sort of a 2019 style top. There's other things that you can look at as well. And I've tried to sort of think about this and which ones are the biggest signal, which ones are not. And the reality is, you can find the evidence you're looking for if you're a bull or if you're a bear. If you are a bull, you're just simply going to say, well, Ben, last cycle, Bitcoin didn't even top until a month before the first rate cut, right? So why should it be any different, right? Last cycle, you can see sort of that mid-cycle top occurred in June, and then we got our first rate cut in July. And the last I checked, we just had a Fed meeting and they didn't cut, and the next meeting is not until June. And so if that's the case, does that mean Bitcoin can go higher in May? And what happens if they don't cut in June? What happens if they just cut in July like they did in 2019? Does that mean Bitcoin can rally into June? Anything's possible, right? I'm not going to say it can't happen. It could happen. That is a scenario that you have to be prepared for. The main counterpoints to such a scenario would be that back then the Fed pivoted. If it were the current cycle, the Fed would have pivoted long ago, right? Based on where they pivoted back in 2019. In fact, in 2019, if you were to look at bankruptcies, right? If you were to look at bankruptcies in the United States, let me see if I can then scroll down. Let me find it right here. Back over here, bankruptcies were just starting to tick back up a little bit, but they were still higher than where they are today. Now, this hasn't been updated, in a while, but I imagine we will get another data point relatively soon. This is still Q4 data, right? If it's still on this same path that it's been on, and we're now in May, then this could theoretically be all the way up here, which is essentially where they pivoted in 2019. The problem is that the rate of change here is a lot greater than it was over here. So if we end up continuing to move at this pace, we'll easily take out these highs. So again, last cycle, when the Fed, is basically the minute that things started to look bad, the Fed pivoted. Hell, at the time, I think the unemployment rate was still going down. If you look at the unemployment rate back then, it was still dropping. Now it's going up. So again, that sort of would be a counterpoint to say, well, yeah, like Bitcoin did top out 1 month before the first rate cut in 2019. But guess what? The Fed was also a lot quicker to pivot back then too. The other counterpoints, of course, are that, well, this also corresponded to gold breaking out, which already occurred, and it corresponded to ETH Bitcoin breaking down, which already occurred. So there's definitely like conflicting things, right? Again, there's the fact that ETH Bitcoin broke down and gold broke out. But there's also this reality of like, well, the Fed hasn't cut yet. And one reason why the Fed hasn't, the Fed not cutting yet has continued to be good for Bitcoin is because, again, if the Fed stays higher for longer, as they've said, where do you want to be? Do you want to be in some random altcoin that has developers that might just give up and move on because they can't wait until looser monetary policy arrives, they run out of money, whatever it is? Or do you just stick with Bitcoin because, even if there are hard times, at least there's a good chance Bitcoin will come out even stronger on the other side, right? Even if there is a drop, even if there is a 2019 style drop. And so that's kind of the thing. And that's why I think Bitcoin continues to be stronger than the rest of the market collectively. And that's the reason why Bitcoin dominance keeps going up and things like ETH Bitcoin keep going down. And by the way, I don't know if you guys noticed, but it had a weekly close below 0.049 again. It actually closed at 0.04899. What a lot of times what happens with these like big milestones where you focus on them for a long time is that the first time you close below it, like everyone's watching it and they're like, oh crap, like it finally happened. And then the people that have been waiting for that, the degens, right, they just bid it up. They're like, all right, well, it's just a deviation. And then they bid it up. And then if it does it again, right, another close below 0.049, then after a little while, people start to think, well, maybe it's not just a deviation, right? Maybe it's just going to keep on going down until looser monetary policy arrives. And I think this one has been a lot quieter of a weekly close below 0.049 than the one we got a few weeks ago. Again, a few weeks ago, everyone was like, that's the bottom, right? And this is just a deviation. It's going to run it back up. But if it keeps doing it, and if attention sort of deviates back to Bitcoin, then you get a situation where like Bitcoin rallies and then it breaks ETH Bitcoin down. And you can actually see that on some lower time frames. So if you look at like an hourly time frame, which we don't do that frequently here, but that's exactly what happens on lower time frames. And you sort of make the same case on higher time frames too. But you'll see this pattern play out where, ETH Bitcoin puts in these higher lows, and then on the fourth test, it breaks down, right? You 1, 2, 3, and then the fourth test, it breaks down on a Bitcoin rally and then back tests it, right? And we did the same thing not that long ago, right? A very similar pattern where you basically have, several tests of the trend line, 1, 2, 3, the fourth one, it breaks down. And you can kind of just see that same pattern playing out over and over and over again. And all while people they go back to Bitcoin, and that's why Bitcoin stays stronger, because that's the safer asset. And so that is something that, you have to remember. And if you look at Bitcoin USD, and if you were to overlay ETH Bitcoin onto this chart, you'll see that, basically ever since Bitcoin got into this range up here, ETH Bitcoin has just been dropping, right? When Bitcoin first got into this range at around, 64K or so, ETH Bitcoin was around 0.056. And then all Bitcoin has really done is gone sideways, and ETH Bitcoin has just dropped. So it's people converting their alts to Bitcoin that is leading, is helping Bitcoin out. But what's helping the altcoin market out? And that's why Bitcoin dominance is probably going to keep going higher. So the thing to look for is, with the bull market support band, it's currently at 56.8K to 57.3K. So, there is still a chance we go back down there in the coming weeks. There's always a chance we go below it, right? I do want to, try to be fair to both views, and also say, this is also a trend line that we've tried to hold here yet again, right? 1, 2, and 3. So we have held it again. And so that's also worth watching. And it also corresponded to the bull market support band. But we've done something similar in prior cycles as well, where you have sort of a trend line that holds for a little bit and then eventually it goes below it. But I just think that Bitcoin is a better place to be than alts. And, if Bitcoin does get a larger correction back down this summer, then, the altcoin market would have gotten hit a lot harder. And if, on the other hand, you find yourself at higher highs this summer, like 2019, then Bitcoin still likely outperformed the altcoin market. And so it's all about, your opportunity cost, right? And your risk-adjusted returns. And if you have Bitcoin, it's not like you're under the illusion that it can't go down, right? It can, and it often does get pretty crazy corrections, sometimes 50%, sometimes even 80%, especially in bear market years. But that's just the reality. That's how Bitcoin works. And every once in a while, it goes down, it cleanses the altcoin market, and then, of course, they come back. But that's sort of the nature of the game. So, the things to look for. First of all, you have the 50-day. We're not that far away from it. The S&P, the Russell, and the NASDAQ are already there. So if Bitcoin wants to just act like a more volatile version of that, then the next stop would be the 66K level. Maybe slightly less than 66, around 66K plus or minus a couple $100, depending on, because again, like by the end of the week, the 50-day SMA is going to be different than what it is while I'm making this video because it's updated every day. But 66K. And then coincidentally, if you look at the 8-week moving average, let me pull this up here. So the 8-week moving average is also about 66K, right? 66.2K. Now you can see that last year, after putting in a local high in April, we faded, and then once we got below the 8-week moving average, we actually went back up to it and got rejected, right? Now we already went up to it here on these wicks, but this is the first weekly close. This was the first sort of the first weekly closes down here below it. Just kind of like these, I guess. This one was too, I guess, but We rallied back up to it, got rejected, went back down to the bull market support band, and then ultimately we took off. I was also trying to look at 2019 too. There is an example. I don't really think it's the best comparison, honestly, but I just want to show it because what happened in 2019 is we took out this low, right? We took out this low from July, and then we got a rally up, and that rally was a pretty nice rally in terms of like the percent move. It was from the low here. It was about a 22% rally, but it ultimately rallied up just above the 50-day SMA. But the point is that it was a 22% rally above the 50-day, but it was a lower low here, right? But then rather than run it all the way back to the highs, we then just came right back down and then put in sort of a double bottom at that lower low. Again, I'm not saying that has to play out, but if it were to play out, right? If it were to play out, that would mean, because again, this is your low and then this is your first lower low. So far, this move has been about a 14% move, right? So it hasn't gone up as much as it did back then, at least not yet. A 22% move would put it all the way back up to, 69K, which is the extent of the move that it had in 2019. But if it were to come back down, back down to 56K or something, the question is would it then continue to emulate 2019? And what's fascinating about this move over here that actually led up into another lower high, but it was a stronger move, right? If you connect the dots, you see that? This stronger move, when did that occur? That stronger move occurred in July, which is when rate cuts occurred. So basically, you finally had looser monetary policy. Bitcoin went on a crazy rally. That doesn't look so crazy when it was a lower high, but it was still about a 35% move. It ended up being a lower high, and then we came back down again. And so, if you look at it over here, at where at this entire move that we've had, there has been a high and there's been a lower high, right? And so if we are going to eventually retest that trend line, which there's no guarantees, but if we do, does that occur after the Fed cuts like it did last time? You could also have this entire move occur at higher prices, right? Because the Fed still hasn't cut and perhaps they're still far away off. But I tend to think that the Fed will cut this summer. That's sort of my base case, is that a rate cut, we will get a rate cut this summer. And by the way, just so there's no ambiguity, when I say this summer, I mean either June, July, or September, because the September is still technically the summer. I think you could get one earlier than September, but I'm not married to that idea. Like, I don't have super strong conviction in that. It doesn't really seem like June is going to happen at this point, but I also wouldn't completely discount it either. The market hasn't. It's mostly discounted that it's not going to happen, but there still is about an 8% chance. The only way you're going to get a rate cut in June is if, something catastrophic happens, right? Or if you get a huge move in the unemployment rate, right? Because we're going to get some more data points between now and then. You're going to get another inflation reading. You're going to get, and by the way, you're also going to be close theoretically to the June inflation reading. I don't know when that's going to come out exactly, but maybe the Fed will get a sort of a tip off as to what it's going to be. But you're at least going to get one more round of unemployment data and just labor market data in general. And so I do think that, as long as that's not terrible, then there's still a good chance they won't cut in June. But if it is bad, then yeah, maybe they would. But even Powell said there, a couple of tenths isn't going to really move the needle for them. I imagine if you saw like 4.2 or 4.3, then maybe they would. But we'll see. Initial claims are still coming in relatively low at this point, so everything seems to be moving pretty slowly. But that's where we are, guys. I don't have a crystal ball. I know everyone. I know there's a lot of pressure on a lot of sort of quote unquote influencers to basically say what's going to happen and how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen. But I don't know how this is going to play out. I'm just sort of outlining these different possibilities. The thing I would look for, if it's like a 2019 scenario, what you would see is just Bitcoin chop around, between these levels for the next month or two while alts go down. If you don't see alts going down as Bitcoin chops, then it's not similar to 2019, But if alts keep bleeding while Bitcoin chops, then it is similar to 2019. And, maybe watch ETH because, while Bitcoin is looking pretty good, compared to ETH, look at ETH. Like, it isn't, honestly, it almost looks like ETH is kind of similar to what Bitcoin did last cycle already, where it put in a low and then it retested that low, right? You see that? It put in a new low from sort of this prior low, and then it already retested that low. So I do sometimes wonder if it, if it's just sort of one cycle behind. And so if ETH were to go back up, right, and if it were to emulate Bitcoin from the last cycle, then that would be sort of the next big test would be this trend line, which is right around 3,300, which is not that much higher than where we currently are. So I would keep an eye on that as well as we get into the next couple of weeks. But that's the update, guys. I don't really have anything else for you. There we are. We did see Bitcoin go down to its bull market support band, just like the S&P, the Nasdaq, and the Russell did. So we speculated on that. It did happen. We said sweep the low, then bounce, to around the mid 60s or so, plus or minus a couple $1,000, and then now we're gonna figure out where we are. Right now, we're gonna figure out if it's 2019 or if it's something else. And again, if it's something else, then instead of chopping for a month or two, you would see it just sort of follow this path, right? If it is 2019, then you could still get above the 8-week, but it would mean still kind of coming back down, kind of like this, right? Where it just, we still had some nice moves. It's not like Bitcoin didn't rally back there. It's just that it still ultimately was a downtrend, right? And if you look at weekly Heikin-Ashi candles, we just had 4 reds in a row. This is the first green one, and the week just started. But that's where we are. Again, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. Check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.